Have you ever stood in the darkness of night, screaming silently, you're a man? Have you ever hoped that a time would come when your voice could be heard in a noonday sun? Have you waited so long till your unheard song has stripped away your very soul? Well then believe it, my friend, that this silence can end. We'll just have to get guns and be men. Has a cry to live when your brain is dead made your body tremble so? And have unseen chains of too many years hurt you so bad till you can't shed tears? Have so many vows from so many mouths made you know that words are just words? Well then believe it, my friend, that this silence can end. We'll just have to get guns and be men. You know that dignity, not just equality, is what makes a man a man. And so you laugh at laws passed by a silly lot that tell you to give thanks for what you've already got. And you can't go on with this time-worn song that just won't change the way you feel. Well, you believe it, my friend, that this silence can end. We'll just have to get guns and be men.
It's 1984. You've read George Orwell, and when you look back on the last 4 years in Turkey since the coup, you get to thinking he was onto something. From time to time, you and your siblings joke about the nature of Big Brother, who the real Emmanuel Goldstein might be, whether the electronics in your house really are listening to you, and even what kind of tortures the sadistic prison guards will think up in their twisted minds when they get a hold of you for thought crime. The topic always conjures up some laughs, the kinds of laughs punctuated by strained facial expressions, blank stares, and uncomfortable silences. All of you have quietly worried that your once innocent, childlike sense of humor has been well and truly killed by more of the gallows variety. No one could blame you, seeing as some of your earliest consciousness of the political order came with the public pronouncements of dozens of people being executed at actual gallows. More and more, you've come to the conclusion that the architects of the military dictatorship that seized power 4 years ago also read 1984, but drew exactly the wrong lessons. George Orwell meant the book as a warning, not an instruction manual. Like most of us, your whole teenage years have been wrapped up in one giant ball of anxiety, but you long for the privilege to be anxious about only the regular things: a first kiss, an encroaching exam, or what your friends might think about the clothes you wear to school. Sure, all of those things have made you uneasy from time to time, but you've been more worried that the stormtrooper gendarmerie will smash through your door every time your mother insists on speaking to you in Kurdish so that you don't forget who you are. Last year it became official. The language of your people is completely banned in Turkey. You were beginning to think you'd never hear it spoken in public again. Of course, you'd heard the rumblings. A revolutionary leaflet strewn by one evening's winds into a corner of the closed metal gate to your father's shop. A whisper or two at school about someone far down a safely distanced chain of relations, a classmate's friends, uncles, neighbors, sisters, co-worker or something, that had slipped into the mountains under the cover of darkness to join the guerrilla. You had trained yourself not to get your hopes up. But just as Orwell again surfaces in your mind, your sister runs in with news that forces you to break your cherished protective taboo. The Kurdistan Workers' Party had in the last days dealt a blow to Big Brother. They had begun their armed struggle and somehow were holding their own. Maybe today the stormtroopers are too busy to break down your door. They're busy shoring up their bases in case the guerrillas come. You and your sister jump up and down with giddiness. You have no plans to fight, but you are glad someone is finally showing the state that its war on your family and your people will not be one-sided. Hope is a dangerous thing. You know that the times ahead will be full of uncertainties. Every joy will likely be matched by a fear or a suffering, but you are suffering and uncertain already, with precious few of the joys. It is late August, and no matter how hard you try to suppress the hope, it keeps bubbling up to the surface. Kurds in the 1960s. This decade marked the real beginning of a Kurdish liberation movement in all four parts of Kurdistan. But it was the 1970s when these struggles really took off, with the 1978 formation of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK. They had prepared for armed struggle until they were ready, or forced, to begin in 1984. Black America in the 1960s saw a massive increase in civil rights activity nationwide, which was specifically centered around destroying legal segregation at first. Activists used tactics such as sit-ins, bus boycotts, marches, voting drives, and traffic blockades to gain equal access to public and civil life within the state structures. In tandem, revolts and riots in many cities helped turn up the heat and increase the pressure on the state to negotiate, even as these tactics were often publicly disavowed by many of the popular civil rights leaders of the time. The massive white backlash to these movements, whatever tactic they used, as well as the continued oppression and lack of real substantive liberation when these gains were achieved, led to the formation of much more militant parties and organizations that did not completely reject violence as a possible means of resistance and focused more on cultural liberation and autonomy. The focus became more similar to what Kurdish people were focused on in that era: restoring traditional cultural practices, connecting with the lives and traditions of their ancestors, fighting against oppression from police and other state forces, and organizing autonomous defense and institutions in their communities that could take care of their people. Assimilation talk became much less popular as the integration movement did not lead to the desired results. An internationalist consciousness grew as Black people in America saw the rise of anti-colonial movements in Africa against European states, and saw similarities in their situation and the situation in Palestine, Latin America, and many other nations around the world. This internationalism most took the form of revolutionary socialism through the lens of Marxist-Leninism or Marxist-Leninism-Maoism. Major Kurdish organizations: Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, PJAK, YPG and YPJ, and YBSH. Alright, before I move into the next section, I have come to a problem that every podcaster or TV journalist or analyst or pretty much anyone dealing with the complexities of Middle East politics and especially Kurdish politics will have to come to, inevitably. There's just no way around it. The acronyms. There are so many acronyms. It is just a lot for a first-timer learning about, new regions, new places, new groups. So I'm going to try to add a description of all of the acronyms, a little key, if you will, in the episode show notes. So now we can proceed, but again, if you need to pause throughout the episode to kind of focus on some acronyms or go back and look at the show notes, please feel free to do so. No one would blame you. The PKK also started as a Marxist-Leninist party, inspired by the national liberation struggles and the establishment of so-called real socialism all over the world. The PKK initially advocated for an independent Kurdish nation-state, uniting all four parts of Kurdistan, with a socialist economy and a dictatorship of the proletariat, later a democratic socialist republic. Their ideology has since completely changed, as they have renounced Marxist-Leninism and the idea of the nation-state, and built their own ideology, democratic confederalism, based on grassroots direct democracy, women's freedom, ethnic and religious pluralism, and ecology. We will get much more into this ideological shift later. It should be noted, however, that calling the PKK at its foundation a purely Marxist-Leninist party is a bit simplistic and even misleading. In Turkey, the state school system was all-pervasive in its propaganda efforts to enforce one mindset on the population. For the students who were able to escape the dominant narrative, they made a choice: to refuse to bow down and accept the world as the state defined it. Marxist-Leninism was merely the most prevalent formulation of the zeitgeist of the time, based on the scale of Soviet influence. While the party latched onto this spirit, the students saw it as just one means to shake off the yoke of the oppressors. The average peasant who joined the party was not steeped in this Marxist tradition, but came to see the PKK as the vehicle most likely to free them from the states that were crushing them in that era. In practice, the socialism of the PKK in the early days was rooted in the communal lifestyles of their diverse tribal societies, not something imposed from Moscow or anywhere outside of their own experiences. The PKK began its armed struggle in earnest and planned for the long term, unlike the Black Panther Party, who never took wide-scale offensive armed action. While the PKK's armed struggle against the state began in 1984 with 2 armed actions against Turkish military outposts and small towns, they had engaged with Kurdish feudal lords and capitalists before, leading to a large split in the support of the Kurdish population. The PKK didn't really become a mass movement with a broad base of support among Kurds until 1992, well after they recruited in Syrian Kurdistan, Rojava. Immediately, the PKK sought support from international states, moving their operations and training camps to Syria and Lebanon after the coup in 1980. These states had contradictions with the Turkish state and were willing to allow the PKK to operate in their borders. Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK's leader, had even been exiled in Syria following the coup and prior to the start of armed operations. This is similar in a way to Eldridge Cleaver's exile in Algeria and his opening of offices there for the Black Panther Party. Because the PKK has never recognized the borders largely imposed on Kurds by Western powers after World War I, they have always organized in all 4 parts of Kurdistan. They moved their operations from the countrysides and cities to the protection of the Zagros Mountains, and very quickly moved into the Qandîl Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, where they are headquartered today. These mountains also give access into Iran and so house the Kurdistan Free Life Party, PJAK, which was formed in 2004 as an affiliate of the PKK focused on Iranian Kurdistan. Remnants of the party and their supporters in Rojava have organized independently for decades, covertly forming the Democratic Union Party, PYD, who began to create autonomous institutions that could meet the needs of Kurds in Rojava as a counterpower to the state. This risky organizing gave them a strong network of defense forces, later formed into the YPG and the all-female YPJ, justice structures, assemblies, cultural institutions, and other infrastructure that was capable of filling the power vacuum left by the Syrian regime withdrawal to focus on their besieged civil war-ridden capital in 2012. Their establishment of autonomous, multi-ethnic, grassroots democratic administration that they hold to this day in northeast Syria has been called the Rojava Revolution, and I cover the inspiring everyday organizing of its citizens extensively in my video, The Communes of Rojava, a model in societal self-direction. While the self-administration of North and East Syria and its associated defense forces grew out of the work of the former PKK members and shared democratic confederalist ideology with the PKK, which we will talk about later, they remain functionally and operationally autonomous from the PKK. In 2014, the Kurdish-speaking Yazidi population of Qandîl in northern Iraq came under genocidal attack by the Islamic State. Thousands of men were executed, while women and children were kidnapped and sold into slavery. Some 50,000 Yazidis were stranded on Sinjar Mountain with no way out. The first to respond, a small contingent of PKK fighters, came down from the Qandîl Mountains and were joined at Sinjar by the YPG. Together, they cleared a humanitarian corridor which allowed some 35,000 Yazidis to escape into Syria. Once the Islamic State was pushed out of Qandîl, the PKK stayed behind to train local Yazidis and formed the Yebeshe, the Qandîli resistance units, and the all-women Yejee, Izid Khan women's units, to prevent the massacres from ever happening again. In 2018, the last PKK fighters completed their work and left Qandîl, empowering the Yebeshe as fully autonomous units. The Yebeshe has since come into partnership with the Iraqi army, retaining its autonomous structure and command. They are the second democratic confederalist organization in Iraqi Kurdistan, along with the Kurdistan Democratic Solution Party, PKK. Together, all of the aforementioned parts of the Kurdish Freedom Movement, spread across all 4 parts of Kurdistan, are confederated into the Kurdistan Communities Union, KCK, or in English, KCK, an umbrella organization.
In the state of Mississippi, many years ago, a boy of 14 years got a taste of Southern law. He saw his friend a-hangin', his color was his crime, and the blood upon his jacket put a brand upon his mind. Too many martyrs and too many dead, too many lies, too many empty words were said, too many times for too many angry men. Oh, let it never be again. His name was Medgar Evers, and he walked his road alone, like Emmett Till and thousands more whose names we'll never know. They tried to burn his home and they beat him to the ground, but deep inside they both knew what it took to bring him down. Too many martyrs and too many dead, too many lies, too many empty words were said, too many times for too many angry men. Oh, let it never be again.
You see the faint bob of the headlights. The bridge you are standing on, the one the procession of cars is approaching, has some history. Legend has it that another black man was hung from it 30 or 40 years ago. Now, in 1965, you and your friends are determined to make sure it doesn't happen again. You take solace knowing you aren't alone. In Louisiana, the Deacons for Defense have shown the way. Sporadic makeshift groups like the one you are now part of have been making stands elsewhere too. Nothing like this has ever happened in this county, at least as far as you know. You were deathly afraid, but you'd be lying if you said you didn't find this all a bit exciting. A whistle. Having helped cobble together a hasty defense plan and some signals moments ago, you know exactly what this means. You slip off the bridge and into a small dirt crevice at its base. You allow yourself a brief moment to quietly honor the man who was allegedly lynched here, and all those who had ever been lynched anywhere. You're glad that you are clinging to an M1 rifle, and that all around you good folks from the community are clinging to high-powered rifles too. The lights that your eyes had been tracking, the sole illumination other than the silver of moonlight peeking through the clouds, abruptly disappear in quick succession. The who's who of influential white men in the community, their faces concealed to give them plausible deniability, assume that their dark cars have carried them into your side of town unnoticed. That's how it's been in the past that these men are so desperately clinging to. But you lean on your ears now instead of your eyes. The crunching gravel marking each revolution of their wheels tells you they have almost reached the point where you and your friends will make yourselves known. There's no turning back now. You allow no other thoughts to enter your mind other than the task at hand. There's nothing left to do now but act. Major black organizations, the Black Panther Party and the Republic of New Africa. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense started in 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale as a black nationalist organization focused on armed defense of mostly segregated black communities in order to intervene in police brutality. They were not the first modern black organization to take up arms in a self-defense capacity. Robert F. Williams, head of the Monroe, North Carolina chapter of the NAACP, also formed the Black Armed Guard, interestingly enough, a local chapter of the National Rifle Association, the NRA. As far back as 1957, they successfully defended the home of an NAACP leader when the KKK carried out an organized and pre-planned armed attack on the residence. The Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist terror organization then popularly supported in the South by many well-to-do white figures, was physically confronted with guns and forced to flee. Not only that, but the defensive action forced the city of Monroe, once complicit in Klan organization, to drive them out of the city. Similarly, the Deacons of Defense had formed in Louisiana in 1964 to give armed defense to civil rights workers in black churches, and had spread throughout the South after successful defensive actions against racist citizens and organizations. Even Martin Luther King had armed bodyguards, and according to the journalist William Worthy, his home was an arsenal. The Black Panther Party built off of this successful tradition of armed community self-defense, bringing the idea to the Bay Area of California. In their part of the country, they saw the police as the most likely people to harass black communities, and thought that simply having an armed black presence in the community would make the police feel a lot less free to abuse citizens. In a 1972 interview with the Swedish reporter, Angela Davis, considered one of the most famous and most enduring voices coming out of the party, spoke to the conditions that black people had faced in the 1960s. She shed light on why the Black Panthers refused to toe the dogmatic line of espousing nothing but nonviolence, like many other civil rights organizations of the time.
See, that's another thing. When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them. On the other hand, because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions. If you are a black person and live in the black community all your life and walk out on the street every day seeing white policemen surrounding you, when I was living in Los Angeles, for instance, long before the situation in LA ever occurred, I was constantly stopped. No, the police didn't know who I was, but I was a black woman. I had a natural, and they, I suppose, thought that I might be a, quote, militant. And when you live under a situation like that constantly, and then you ask me, you know, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Bull Connor, would often get on the radio and make statements like, niggers have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the 4 young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Carol? We heard about the bombing, and I don't have my car. And they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all of the men organized themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. What it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
Though the initial focus was just on training and organizing black people for defense, The Panthers later became a revolutionary organization, adopting the Marxist-Leninist Maoist line that was predominant in revolutionary movements worldwide in the late 1960s. Due to the fact that the United States generally had so many different ethnic groups living close together, the Black Panther Party never really saw the foundation of a separate black nation-state as an option, as some other black organizations did, including the Republic of New Africa, from which the organization Cooperation Jackson was eventually formed. However, both the Black Panther Party and the Republic of New Africa, at least initially, were not opposed to or afraid of state power, and both saw it at least part of their goals as taking state power, whether the United States federal government, first in revolutionary fashion and later electorally as with the Black Panthers, or the reins of a separate, new and independent state as with the RNA, the Republic of New Africa. Complementing their ideology, the Panthers laid out a 10-point program towards community autonomy, full employment, radical education, land and housing, and liberation from the police and prisons, among other things. In their early years, the party sought a socialist economy and a revolutionary state, but embraced survival programs pending revolution, which were in practice quite similar to the projects now carried out by the communes and cooperatives in Bakur and Rojava following the PKK's later embrace of democratic confederalism. The Panther survival program sought to meet the needs of working-class black people at the most local level, and give them a measure of autonomy that would isolate them from white dominance and control. A major portion of party efforts near their headquarters in Oakland, California, were put toward armed demonstrations. These actions utilized California's open carry laws and sought to accomplish several goals: to send a message to the police that there was a serious armed force based around self-defense of black communities, to normalize the idea of armed action within the black community against racism, to serve as Know Your Rights campaigns for black citizens, and to practically decrease police willingness and ability to harass black residents. While these actions caused a local and even statewide stir, the Black Panther Party chose to make themselves more nationally known in a spectacular fashion. On May 2, 1967, the California state legislature was debating what would become some of the first gun control legislation in the 20th century United States. Gun control for enslaved and freed black communities had been a constant feature of American history in some form or another, and this law was specifically targeted at the Black Panther Party's open carry demonstrations. As the assembly convened, 26 Panthers, led by Bobby Seale, entered carrying rifles, and their actions completely took the press spotlight from the politicians. Despite facing arrests, the actions put the party name on the map. Within a few years, there were dozens of party chapters across the country, hundreds of thousands of regular readers of the party newspaper, and the Black Panthers were a household name. The party never took wide-scale offensive armed action, but they did engage in many small-scale skirmishes with police and state authorities, both as part of their community defense actions and in isolated offensive ambushes. Their offices were raided all over the country, and in several cities, Panthers barricaded the offices and engaged in firefights to protect them. As a result of such conflicts, several leaders, including their Minister of Information, Eldridge Cleaver, fled abroad to places like Algeria and Cuba, usually state socialist countries where they found refuge and attempted to build internationalist ties and open up party offices. These travels actually inspired the formation of similar parties amongst other oppressed groups around the world, such as the Dalit Panthers in India and the British Black Panthers. In the early 1970s, incredibly heavy repression from state and internal political differences had fractured the movement's top leadership and forced the party to focus more on Oakland, where it was founded. Their revolutionary prospects had waned with the times, and they put more effort towards local elections in Oakland, finding mixed success through constant hounding in the media, thorough-going repression by the FBI, self-destructive behaviors among its leadership, and elections siphoning out all the money from autonomous infrastructure. The once revolutionary Black Panther Party was hollowed out and completely defanged by the end of the decade. At the height of Panther influence in the western United States, the Republic of New Africa was winning the hearts and minds of well-known Black Freedom Movement figures in the southeastern United States. The RNA was founded in 1968, advocating Black nationalism and secession from the United States. They concentrated on the Black Belt states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and North Carolina, where the largest percentage of the Black population in the U.S. lives to this day. They formed a provisional government with Robert F. Williams, made famous by his advocacy and practice of armed community defense, as its president in exile, and Betty Shabazz, the widow of Malcolm X, as its second vice president. In the event of coming to power, the Republic of New Africa's government meant to pursue policies of Black economic cooperativism and both decentralized local self-defense and a national military. Like the Kurdish Freedom Movement, supporters of the RNA saw themselves as needing to create a new independent state in the areas where they had a majority, and did not rule out possible guerrilla warfare to gain international recognition for that state. Outside of their aspirations for a new state, they demanded reparations for slavery and Jim Crow from the United States, and a referendum to allow African descendants in America to vote on whether or not they wanted to be citizens of the United States, a legal status forced on them by the 14th Amendment. Unlike the Black Panther Party, the Republic of New Africa was able to maintain consistent organizing well past the 1980s. Their spirit would also be carried into the work of the New African People's Organization, NAPO, and the Malcolm X grassroots movement, both still concentrated in the southeastern United States. It is from these organizations that the Jackson Kush Plan and Cooperation Jackson would be born, efforts which are currently transforming the city of Jackson, Mississippi, and inspiring advocates of community autonomy and solidarity economics worldwide. Hi, I'm Ian Campbell, or Neighbor Democracy. Thank you for listening to Episode 2, The End of Silence, which happens to be the name of our first song, The End of Silence, by Elaine Brown, an important member in the Black Panther Party and a prolific singer. Then we came in with the interlude, Too Many Martyrs by Phil Ochs, about the murder of Medgar Evers, an NAACP field secretary. It also kind of relates to the Kurdish martyr culture, where anyone who is killed in the fight for freedom is called a martyr. And finally, we are finishing with Ciwan Haco's Leşker, meaning soldier. Ciwan Haco made lots of revolutionary anthems throughout the 1980s, and he continues to write songs today. That's all I have for this episode, so tune in next time for Episode 3, The Panther and the Guerrilla.
Hortin Kurdistan, evrabuna Serbiyan. Kaçı hortin Kurdistan, evrabuna Serbiyan. Desavetna çakan, kaşiyana serçiyan. Desavetna çakan, kaşiyana serçiyan. Darzgar ki Kurdistan, Darzgar ki Kurdistan. درزگار کردستان